Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in today. This is the Bodega Cat Book Club Financial Edition. And today we're continuing our reading of The Creature from Jekyll Island. Sorry about the glare. Okay, this was written by G. Edward Griffin. And today we're going to be reading chapter 16, and this is part 2. So, and since you're here with us, after this episode, be sure to check out our website and our other book clubs as well. We have the spiritual book clubs on Mondays, health book clubs on Wednesdays, and then of course the financial book club on Thursdays. And we have a monthly newsletter that we put out and podcasts that we interview very interesting people. And we also have merch, and check out our YouTube channel. And if you're in the LA area, Los Angeles area, come and visit us in person in our healing center. We use scalar technologies based on Nikola Tesla's research called the EE system, energy enhancement system, uh, where you can get some healing, get rejuvenized, relax, all that good stuff. Okay, let's do this. Oh, okay. Let me move this camera in a little bit more so you guys can see. If you have a book, you could follow us with us there. If not, you can, follow with us here. Whatever works for you, right? Okay, wildcat banks. For example, it was during this period that wildcat banks began to flourish. They were given that name not because they were untamed, although that would have been another good reason to do so, but because they were located in areas so remote in the frontier that it was said that their only customers were wildcats. Wildcat banks were not noted for meticulous accounting or business practices. Like all the banks at that time, they were required to keep a certain portion of their deposits on hand in the form of gold or silver coin. To engender public confidence in their faithfulness to their obligation, it was a common practice to keep the vault door open so a keg or two of gold coins could be viewed during business hours. Not altogether different from the modern practice of financial institutions advertising how many billions in assets they hold, but never mentioning the size of their liabilities. The wildcatters, however, were not reluctant to sprinkle a few precious metal coins over the top of nails and let that take care of public relations. In some cases, as state examiners went from bank to bank to check the reserves, the gold would arrive only a few minutes ahead of them, having been rushed from the vaults of the bank previously audited. The point is that the Bank of the United States was able to place considerable restraint upon the practices of all banks, both wildcat and urban. It did this simply by refusing to accept the notes of any other bank unless it had a reputation for redeeming those notes in specie on demand. The public reacted accordingly. If the notes if the notes were not good enough for the Bank of the United States, they were not good enough for them either. This served as an indirect force of moderation that affected all banks of that time. And that too was good. Some historians have said that the bank was a positive force in yet another way. Galbraith, for example, writes admiringly, on occasion, the Bank of the United States came to the assistance of good state banks that were being besieged by their vote. Um, okay, sorry, let's do that again. On occasion, the Bank of the United States came to the assistance of good state banks that were being besieged by their note holders or other creditors. So, besides enforcing restraint, it served also as the lender of last resort. Thus, in its short span of life, it went far to perceive and develop the basic regulatory functions of a central bank. And that quote was from Galbraith, page 73. One who is less enamored with the idea of a central bank would be tempted to ask, if those state banks were so good, why did they need assistance in keeping faith with their depositors? The whole idea of a lender of last resort, which is accepted as sacred dogma today, is based on the assumption that it is perfectly acceptable for the entire banking system to be fraudulent. It is assumed that any single bank or cluster of banks could at any time become, quote, besieged by their note holders or other creditors. Therefore, it is prudent to have a central bank to take what meager reserves there are within the system and rush them from bank to bank, if not minutes before the examiner arrives, at least before the customers do. As for the much talked about restraint exercised over other banks, it is not unreasonable to think that the same effect would have developed even without the presence of a government bank. If the free market had been left to operate, it is certain that before long, one or more banks would gain a deserved reputation for honesty and full faith with their depositors. They would become the most popular banks and therefore the most prosperous. In order to accomplish this, however, they would have to reject the worthless notes of other banks. The public would react as expected, and even the most unscrupulous banks would have to toe the line if they wanted to survive. Moderation would be forced on the entire banking system as a result of open competition within a free market. To assume that only a federally chartered central bank could have brought moderation into the monetary system is to believe that only politicians, bureaucrats, and agencies of government can act with dignity, a shaky notion at best. An instrument of plutocracy. In any event, there is no denying the fact that the Bank of the United States did provide some braking force to the runaway tendencies of many of the nation's private banks. So it could have been worse. The inflation that it caused by its own activities could have been enlarged even further by the activities of the other banks as well. But that it could have been worse does not make it good. As it was, the bank was the means by which the American people lost 42% of the value of all the money they earned or possessed during just those 5 years. We must not forget either that this confiscation of property was selective. It did not work against the wealthy classes, which were able to ride the wave of inflation aboard the raft of tangible property which they owned. And it especially did not work against those elite few, the political and monetary scientists, who were making huge profits from the enterprise. The bank had done precisely what Hamilton had advocated: unite the interest and credit of rich individuals with those of the state. The development of this plutocracy was well described by Governor Morris, the former delegate of New York who had helped to draft the Constitution into its final form. He had been an assistant to Robert Morris, not related, and was a champion of the concept of natural aristocracy. So he knew his subject well when he warned, "The rich will strive to establish their dominion and enslave the rest. They always did. They always will. They will have the same effect here as elsewhere, if we do not, by such a government, keep them within their proper spheres." We should remember that the people never act from reason alone. The rich will take advantage of their passions and make these the instruments for opposing them. The result of the contest will be a violent aristocracy or a more violent despotism. And that quote was written on on July 12th. Oh boy, I need to wake up this morning. That quote was written on July 2nd, 1787, in a letter to James Madison, quoted in Prosperity Economics by W. Cleon Skousen. Freeman Digest, February 1985, page 9. The tide of political pressure against the bank was steadily rising during these years. It is tempting for critics of the central bank mechanism to attribute that to the awakening common sense of the American public. Unfortunately, the picture is not that pleasing. It is true that the Jeffersonian Republicans were eloquently holding forth against the creature's progenitor, and their influence was substantial. But there was another group that joined with them, which had almost exactly opposite ideas and goals. The Jeffersonians opposed the bank because they believed it was unconstitutional and because they wanted a monetary system based only upon gold and silver coin. The other group was made up of the wildcatters, the land speculators, and the empire building industrialists. They opposed the bank because they wanted a monetary system with no restraints at all, not even those associated with fractional reserve. They wanted every local bank to be free to create as much paper money as the public would swallow, because they would then use that money for their own projects and profit. Indeed, politics does produce strange bedfellows. As the time approached for renewal of the bank's charter, the battle lines inched toward each other. They were of equal force. The halls of Congress echoed with the cannon roar of angry debate. The vote was deadlocked. Another attack and counterattack. Again, a deadlock. Into the night, the forces clashed. When the smoke of battle lifted, the bill for charter renewal had been defeated by one vote in the House and one vote cast by Vice President George Clinton to break the to break the tie in the Senate. And so on January 24th, 1811, the Bank of the United States closed its doors. The battle may have been decided, but the war was far from over. The losers, bitter with defeat, merely regrouped their forces and began to prepare for the next encounter. Unfortunately, the events that followed were ideally suited for their plans. With the moderating effect of the bank now removed from the scene, the nation's banking system passed wholly into the hands of the state chartered corporations, many of which were imbued with the wildcat mentality. Their numbers grew rapidly, and so did the money supply which they created. Inflation followed in their footsteps. Public dissatisfaction began to rise. If the free market had been allowed to operate, it is likely that competition soon would have weeded out the wildcatters and restored balance to the system. But it was never given a chance. The War of 1812 saw to that. The War of 1812. The War of 1812 was one of the most senseless wars in history. The primary cause, as we are told, was the British impressment into the navy of American sailors on the high seas to assist in the war against Napoleonic France. But the French had done exactly the same thing to assist in the war against England, yet their acts were ignored. Furthermore, the British had already rescinded their policy regarding American seamen before the war was underway, which means that the cause of the war had been removed, and peace could have been restored in honor if Congress had so wanted. One must conclude that the pro-banking interests in the United States actually wanted the conflict between the profits, actually wanted the conflict because of the profits that it could be realized from it. As evident of this is the fact that the New England states, which were home to the seamen who had been impressed into service, were firmly against the war, while the western and inland southern states, which were home to the myriad of wildcat banks, howled loudly for a clash of arms. In any event, the war was unpopular with the average citizen, and it was out of the question for Congress to obtain funding armaments, not ornaments, for armaments through an increase in taxes. So the government needed the state banks to create that money outside the tax structure and came to their rescue to protect them from the discipline of the free market. It was a classic case of the unholy alliance, the cabal, that always develops between political and monetary scientists. Professor Rothbard gives the details. The US government encouraged an enormous expansion in the number of banks and in banknotes and deposits to purchase the growing war debt. These new and recklessly inflationary banks in the middle Atlantic, southern, and western states printed enormous quantities of new notes to purchase government bonds. The federal government then used these notes to purchase arms and manufactured goods in England. By August 1814, it became clear that the banks of the nation, apart from New England, could not pay in specie, that they were insolvent. Rather than allow the banks of the nation to fail, the governments, state and federal, decided in August 1814 to allow the banks to continue in business while refusing to redeem their obligations in specie. In other words, the banks were allowed to refuse to pay their solemn contractual obligations. This general suspension was not only highly inflationary at the time, it set a precedent for all financial crises from then on. Whether the US had a central bank or not, the banks were assured that if they inflated together and then got in trouble, the government would bail them out. And we see that happening in over and over, isn't it? In the 2008 Enron, what else? AGI or AIG, uh, all the big banks, I don't remember, Goldman Sachs, all that. Anyways, that quote was from Rothbard, Mystery, page 198 to 199. The state banks had created enough instant money for the federal government to raise the debt from $45 million to $127 million, a staggering sum for the fledgling nation. Tripling the money supply with no appreciable increase in goods means the value of the means the value of the dollar shrank to about one-third its former purchasing power. By 1814, when the depositors began to awake to the scam and demanded their gold instead of paper, the banks closed their doors and had to hire extra guards to protect officials and employees from the angry angry crowds. Okay, wake up, Christina. Once again, the monetary and political scientists had succeeded in fleecing the American public of approximately 66% of all the money they had held during that period. And that was on top of the 42% fleecing they got a few years earlier by the Bank of the United States. Juggling tricks and banking dreams. Leaning against the storm of paper money all this time was Thomas Jefferson, by now past president of the United States. Trying to bring the nation to its senses, he never ceased speaking out against the evil of dishonest money and debt. Although all the nations of Europe have tried and trodden every path of force and folly in the fruitless quest of the same object, yet we still expect to find in juggling tricks and banking dreams that money can be made out of nothing and in sufficient quantity to meet the expense of heavy war. That phrase or that quote was from Writings, Library Edition, volume, I think it's 19, no, 14, 14, page 227. The toleration of banks of paper discount costs the United States one half of their war taxes, or in other words, doubles the expenses of every war. And that quote was from Writings, Library Edition, volume 13, page 364. The crisis then of the abuses of banking is arrived. The banks have pronounced their own sentence of death. Between 200 and 300 millions of dollars of their promissory notes are in the hands of the people for solid produce and property sold, and they, the banks, formally declared that they will not pay them. Paper was received on a belief that it was cash, gold, and such scenes are now to take place as will open the eyes of credulity and of insanity itself to the dangers of a paper medium abandoned to the discretion of avarice and of swindlers. And that quote was from Letter to Dr. Thomas Cooper, September 10, 1814. Writings, Library Edition, Volume 14, page 187 to 189. It is a wise rule never to borrow a dollar without laying a tax at the same instant for paying the interest annually and the principal within a given term. And that quote was from Writings, Library Edition, Volume 13, page 269. Okay. We shall consider ourselves unauthorized to saddle posterity with our debts and morally bound to pay them ourselves. So that quote was from IBIT, page 358. Sorry about the back and forth. I hope that's not too dizzying. Okay, another quote. The earth belongs to the living, not the dead. We may consider each generation as a distinct nation with a right to bind themselves, but not the succeeding generation. And that quote was from IBIT, page 270. Okay, and the last quote. The modern theory of the perpetuation of debt has drenched the earth with blood and crushed its inhabitants under burdens ever accumulating. And that quote was from IBIT, page 272. And still, Congress did not listen. That's because they're in on it. They like the money. They like the wealth, the elite status. They've sold their soul to the devil. Okay. Summary. America had its first central bank even before the Constitution was drafted. It was called the Bank of North America and was chartered by the Continental Congress in 1781. Modeled after the Bank of England, it was authorized to issue more paper promissory notes than it held in deposits. In the beginning, these notes were widely circulated and served as a national currency. Although the bank was essentially a private institution, it was designed for the purpose of creating money to lend to the federal government, which it did from the start. The Bank of North America was riddled with fraud, and it quickly fell into political disfavor. Its inflated banknotes eventually were rejected by ordinary citizens and ceased to circulate outside the bank's home city of Philadelphia. The charter was allowed to expire, and in 1783, it was converted into a purely commercial bank chartered by the state of Pennsylvania. The advocates of fiat money did not give up. In 1791, the first Bank of the United States, America's second central bank, was created by Congress. The new bank was a replica of the first, including fraud. Private investors in the bank were among the nation's most wealthy and influential citizens, including some congressmen and senators. But the largest investment and the most powerful influence in the new bank came from the Rothschilds in Europe. The bank set about immediately to serve its function of creating money for the government. This led to a massive inflation of the money supply and rising prices. In the first 5 years, 42% of everything people had saved in the form of money was confiscated through a hidden tax called inflation. This was the same phenomenon that had plagued the colonies less than 2 decades earlier, but instead of being caused by printing press money, it was now fueled by fractional reserve bank notes created by a central bank. As the time for renewal of the bank's charter approached, two groups with opposite intentions became strange political allies against it. The Jeffersonians, who wanted sound money, and the frontier banks, called wildcatters, who wanted unlimited license to steal. On January 24th, 1811, the charter was defeated by one vote in the Senate and one in the House. The central bank was gone, but the wildcatters were everywhere. The War of 1812 was not popular among the American public, and funding would have been impossible through taxes alone. The government chose to fund the war by encouraging wildcat banks to purchase its war debt bonds and convert them into banknotes, which the government then used to purchase war material. Within 2 years, the nation's money supply had tripled, and so had prices. Once again, the monetary and political scientists had succeeded in fleecing the American public of approximately 66% of all the money they held during that period. And that was on top of the 42% fleecing they got a few years earlier by the Bank of the United States. End of chapter 16. Boy, some people never learn, do they? They make the same mistakes over and over. And it doesn't sound like they're very creative either. I mean, the first charter they copied from this, I mean, the second charter they copied from the first charter. The current charter they copy from the previous charter kind of thing. And they never really change. Wow, interesting, eh? Okay, I hope you enjoyed that. We'll continue our reading next time. And in the meantime, I hope you guys all have a great day. Okay, bye-bye now.